we should start with exploring ways that female leadership is understood and practiced in the African context, and particularly for women. In much of the global discourse, African countries are portrayed as sort of uniformly patriarchal, where women are oppressed or sort of in need of some form of external intervention of empowerment. And Ragnhild, you've researched on several field research in several African contexts. How does your findings challenge or affirm these sort of stereotypes that we have about female leadership in Africa?
Yeah, I think first of all that there are. Thank you. There are a lot of stereotypes about that, and I think also the idea about what female leadership is and which kind of institutions that matter is affecting the ideas we have around it. First of all, I think it's important to say that when one back in the 1990s really started to have this idea that women should be more present in politics and also should be more influential in politics, that some of the African countries were really some of those countries where you could see a change really fast. Countries like Uganda, South Africa were some of the pioneers of including women in political leadership. And after in the 80s, where you had all these different World Congress with women, and I think that it's important to say that this was really something that came up, and it was also an internal process that one found out, for instance, in South Africa and Uganda, other countries where there had been a struggle for liberation, that women were part of that fight, and they had all different kinds of leadership. And then they also took part in how to restructure the politics. And even before that, of course, women have been, before that and back in the history, women have been having different types of roles. In, for instance, Malawi that I've been studying, you have this matriarchal society where you have, where women leadership was really important, and it was in some cultures and in some parts you really had women who were leaders. But of course we know about colonization, and then the colonists tended to see only male as leaders and did not see the structures of that were there, like matriarchal societies, that there was actually a possibility that women could be leaders. So I think that a lot of these kind of historical ideas that there's been these important, all through history, there have been this very important women leadership in Africa. But still, I think that we tend to now think about, okay, are there any African women leaders? Are there any presidents? No. So, okay, the society is patriarchal in a way. It's kind of making it a bit easy and stereotypical, and we are kind of affected by that, I think.
Lisa, you've studied female customary leadership and more traditional sort of community-based type of leadership. How does that correlate with the understanding of the understanding that we have of leadership in the Western context? How do you define and understand female leadership in these more traditional contexts?
Well, it's I will pick from where Ragnhild kind of left off. There is the example of matrilineal societies in which there is co-leadership. There is always a male and a female leader, so both are considered important. There have been studies, and these are very big influential studies in Africa by Ifema Liumi and Yoroko, who have studied sort of differences between generations, of how generations are more important. So when can women be leaders, not so much whether they can be leaders, right? And how certain leaderships, leadership positions were not gendered, and it's sort of coloniality kind of gendered them, because it was not imagined that women could take those positions, but they could be taken both by men and women. And so customarily there is usually, whether matrilineal or patrilineal societies, there is usually a woman. I usually give the example in patrilineal societies, like in Southern Africa, among the Soto, the Zulu, and that you do not choose the king, you choose the mother of the king, which is the she-elephant. So, so the presence of women in politics is usually there. It's just not seen. And so what the idea that, based on my research that I have been working on now, is how these customary imaginations of women in politics actually have spearheaded and helped Africa change, sort of get the women back into the visible leadership that coloniality kind of had taken them out or put in the sort of in the back burner. So there is sort of, I think, a connection between what is happening and why Africa seems to have had such a change, because there is really an imagination. One of the aspects that has been studied a bit more, and maybe Ronhill has also come across it, is the mobilizers, so the political mobilizers during campaigns. And so in my research, I have found this long-running category of women that were mobilizers that would not be considered political mobilizers because there weren't elections, there weren't campaigns. They were mobilizers of labor, of enslaved labor, and therefore they were considered sort of underlings. But when I talked to people in the field, the way they interlinked, they said that they are like the women's movement. And the women's movement is historically connected to this, for example, freedom fighting, right? And there are so many examples of women who have led rebellions against colonialists. So history pinpoints their presence constantly in the change of society, in making decisions. We just, when we look at it, we either look at it as exceptions, or we look at it as not exactly political. For example, if you're saying, okay, these women are organizing the forced labor, these women are organizing the slaves, that is not politics. But if people, when then they imagine that, well, actually, this role is the same as the ones who are doing the campaigns, then we should think about it. Okay, so there's something there.
And Irene, I like what you said about it's not whether women can be leaders, it's when they can be leaders, and that's something that we've discussed, within the concept of situational leadership. And you have a first-hand experience of, conflict situations and how that impacts communities, how that impacts the sort of the leadership roles and the power dynamics in local communities. Can you, in your view, can you share some experiences that you've had and where you've witnessed this form of leadership of women yeah?
Yes, so it's more like circumstantial leadership. I was born in Congo, DRC, and in a place where it was actually a small place with big family. And when the war came to my village, the first people that disappeared in a way, it was the men, either into military, some died, and so we had to flee the country. And I remember it was the women that were protecting us, the kids. And I would say that I'm sitting here because of the women and how they chose to, all the decisions that were made at that time was really the one that helped me and the other kids around. So for me, I've always seen, when I think about leadership, I don't always think about the CEOs and or this fancy title, but more, that kind of experience. And I come from a society where it's patriarchal, but then the women, I never look at them as sad or because we have, for example, the sister of my father, they are also my father in a way, and they had a very, very strong role, and maybe they're more powerful than the dad in a way. So I come also from a society with where the women have a strong roles. Yeah.
I think it's important for us to also recognize these sort of traditional forms of leadership, situational, circumstantial leaderships, and customary. Do you see that being recognized in the formal structures that we measure female leadership by? Political representation, for example, is sort of what we consider as the universal measure of women leadership. Some countries have been, on the African continent, have been best in class in terms of gender quotas and gender parity. But does political representation truly recognize these informal forms of leadership, in your view?
Say something, yeah. It's a bit complicated, but I think that sometimes they kind of reinforce each other as well. In some countries, you could also see where you have strong matrilineal society, you can also see that in those areas they have a tendency of producing more political, at least in contexts where you do not have the quotas. So you don't have that, but. For instance, in a country that I know quite well, Malawi, you can see that some areas are matrilineal and some are patrilineal, and then in those areas where the inhabitants are mostly matrilineal, they also have more women representatives elected to the parliament and also to the local level. And they have women chiefs, and they have so when you have women chiefs, and you kind of also reinforce each other as well. So it's not necessarily that they are two different structures that do not kind of have any connections with each other's. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, of course. And but there are also, and then in other parts you have these customary systems that are really patrilineal, and it's very difficult for women to. You will never see a woman chief, although you can actually have women elected representatives. So it's not. So it's kind of a mix. But there's been some very interesting studies where they actually are looking at. So if the society is matrilineal, do that kind of produce a stronger kind of belief in women as the leaders, also in politics, and they find out that it does actually. So this kind of, but of course there's from a few settings, and I'm not sure how this looks like in other countries. Yeah.
How's your experience, Carmelita?
Yeah, well, I like to look at the exceptions. So, and I think that Anil looks at the patterns. So I might have this biased look into it, and so I think a lot of things play into it. I do agree that the systems reinforce each other and need each other. For example, in the case of Mozambique, and it wasn't the only case, after independence, all these customary sort of structures, the state tried to eliminate them because, in the case of Mozambique, they accused them of being sort of complicit with colonialism, and so they were denigrated and tried to eliminate it. But then they realized that the state couldn't function without the influence of these customary leaders that were close to their people, that function within the same sort of cosmological views and views of structures and society and hierarchies. So they started collaborating, but trying to sort of have a control over them, and there's still something of that. And there is this kind of back and forth on who is more influential. So it does play a role. The customary practices does play a role on how people get and who gets into the state, and some of these customary do become more formal representatives. They might also be eventually elected. and matrilineality plays a role in the imagination that women can be leaders. I agree with that. Having said that, for example, we have islands of Nguni Islands in matrilineal areas. There are the remnants of the Mfekan, that was the sort of the Zulu migration up to the north of Mozambique. And so as they moved on, they conquered people and they left some of sort of Nguni speakers in areas where there, and these are patrilineal, very clearly patrilineal societies that are kind of islands where around them these matrilineal societies exist. And there is an example of a woman chief leading one of these Nguni islands. So it can happen even in patrilineal societies. Is it the influence of being close to matrilineal societies? Is it the absence of male leaders, for example, in societies where men migrate a lot in southern Mozambique, they go to South Africa. Sometimes women become chiefs. Is it the absence of men? Is it economics? So there are factors that can lead to the acceptance of women chiefs. I have a difficulty in saying that it is the exception, because it happens relatively frequently, and even in societies that we call patrilineal, highly patriarchal. We have so many examples across Africa, and in historians, African historians, do point systematically towards the matriarchal, that despite patriarchy, African societies are highly matriarchal, whether matrilineal or patrilineal. So, anthropologically speaking, there are many things that work towards it. I'm partially inclined to a strong influence of economic reality. So I think we have sort of progression and regression in terms of the possibilities for women, depending on how well we're doing economically.
If we look back into the question of political representation and gender quotas, which is sort of looked at as the measure that increases the numbers in political participation, and an assumption that will automatically translate into political influence, and decision-making power for women. How is your experience with the gender quotas actually leading to that? Is there, what do you see as the gap there? You mentioned that yes, we have the gender quotas, but then it's not so often that we see women presidents or prime ministers or people in women in high positions. Where's the gap there?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that sometimes gender quota is important to actually give women the opportunity to be present. But it kind of stops there, even though our expectations are sometimes beyond that. In a lot of countries, and also how the quotas work is just to be some kind of measure to put women into political offices, and all kind of, not necessarily put women there, but to have a gender balance in political office. But it's kind of, and then if you have this, sometimes we think that if you have a numeric balance somehow, that then it will evolve into women being more influential. But of course there are these different things that it also takes more, because even if you are elected into a parliament, you need a lot of both networks. You need need knowledge. You need to know who to turn to. You need to have someone to go to, and also I've been interviewing quite a few elected representatives who says that being a parliamentarian, for instance, is a very lonely thing, because you are someone back in where you're coming from, in your constituency. You're someone who are people know and you recognize you, and people always come over for you to talk, and then you are elected into the national parliament, and you sit there and you're really alone and you don't know the game.
Yeah.
So this kind of so there's been these efforts of, okay, so if we do get a more diverse parliament, we also need some kind of structure to learn people how to actually perform in that role, not necessarily just be there and expect that it's going to happen just because you put there, but also that you actually need to learn how to do things. So learn that you can be given advices as to how to do things. But of course it's difficult, because if you go in there and then you're elected into parliament, and also the voters expect you to be agents of change, and someone is actually going to change something, because that's why you're there. You wanted to do something, and then you have these mentors saying that you should do this and this and this now that you are an elected parliamentarian. This is how we expect you to behave. So are you then able to change anything if you just kind of, the only thing you can do to be there is actually to change and be like those that you are kind of opposing in a way. So it's kind of a difficult thing, but and also this kind of even in parliaments that's been male dominant and then women comes in, what is the expectations, and should we kind of do something different then, and or should we kind of learn how to play the game? It's kind of I think there's a lot of conflicts that people experience about who you actually should be then, and what should you actually do with this mandate that you have got. Yeah.
Do you feel like these gender quotas have some form of unintentional negative effect, that it kind of maintains the status quo, that you kind of lean back and say, okay, we've got the number balance in order, so and show that off as a change, a real change?
I think it's possible, and I think in the beginning there was a lot of negativism against quotas, because would you just bring in tokens who would just sit there and they would actually be the agents of possibly the regime, because they are just supposed to be there and as maybe even not as symbols, but just kind of sit there, and then when I looking for this expectation that something is going to change, and also that possibly also the priorities of a parliament should change because you have more women in there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, but the processes of how policy making is done is not necessarily that you have elected more women and they are increasing and then you can kind of change everything. So I'm not sure, but I'm always thinking that sometimes quota is necessary, but that it's not really, and there is more that needs to be done if you really want to expect change. And also you can also have a debate, why do you think that bringing more women in should contribute to change? Should it just be about justice? Why should there be why should men monopolize parliaments? Should there also be women, and should women have the right to be there? And does it end there? By just women having the same chances of taking the spaces that were previously male? Or do we kind of expect them to do something different? Do we expect more of them to both be there and also kind of bring something new? Is it not good enough just to be a rank and file parliamentarian? So should also kind of be these champions who's kind of making big changes every day.
Carmelisa, where do you see the sort of the challenges, the structural challenges between what's the efforts that are being made and then not really achieving the impact that we see that these efforts will have, or the positive change? Where are the gaps here?
Yeah, my answer is always capitalism.
Yeah. What do you mean with that?
So the big discussions that are happening now in feminist spaces and social justice spaces are around how capitalism is not allowing for redistribution, is contributing to extraction, to inequality. And so while when we have inequality, when we have extractive economies, when we don't have redistribution, and we have general inequality, how will then we achieve gender equity if we can't even achieve the just general equality, right? So societies are so unequal now that opportunities are difficult across the board, and so it makes it even more difficult to sort of be also managing to have a certain equity for women. And what ends up happening, we can actually have the women in parliament and all the quotas can be functioning, but then we will probably have the rank and file, the ones that work according to the party lines. We will have conservative women, and so the conservative agendas will be there. The inequality will continue to exist, and sort of this objective that I think that we are working towards, that it's not just to have women present, but to have some transformation and have some change, will not happen. So we might see women coming in, we might see women in leadership, but the transformative effect of why we want this, it will not be happening. That is where I think it is.
You've Ragnhild, if I come back to you again, if in your exploration of electoral financing and political representation, how do you think we mentioned this the capitalism and access to inequality and access to resources? How do you think increasing the importance of money, the increasing importance of money in politics, disproportionately affects women?
There's been these efforts of both trying to make rules about how the involvement of money in politics. So you could try to, for instance, in some countries there are these government could also fund political parties, for instance. But in a lot of contexts, also in Africa, it's not necessarily seen as something that governments should do to fund parties, and then like we do have here in Norway, for instance, we have the state is funding the party so they can kind of do the party organization and organize. But it's not, sometimes it's seen as, but parties are supposed to be autonomous of the state, so why should the state fund? And also if the state is funding, wouldn't they kind of, to prefer the incumbent that is the biggest party, so most funds will go to the ruling party in a way. So this kind of idea of funding parties and also using funding to parties as a measure, because that's what we've seen happening in countries like France, for instance, and in other countries, that they can use funding as a way, so the state could say, we only fund you if you bring more women in or you have a more kind of gender equality agenda in your party. For instance, also in Finland, you do get funding if you do have these kind of events that parties have these events that is going to bring up women. But what they have been doing, for instance, in some countries, also in Africa, is that, for instance, the government and also together with different aid organizations are giving funding to women's campaign in order to actually get up there and be able to stand, because it's so many money in politics, and to just to travel around, to be at meetings, to mobilize, to buy T-shirts to your crew and all that. It just takes a lot of money, and also sometimes there is also expectations of giving money to, for instance, the traditional leaders, because not necessarily you can look upon it as corruption for the traditional leader to support you, but there could also be these things that you could give to rent the premises of the traditional leaders. That's kind of awful way of seeing it. So there's a lot of money just to kind of be in politics, so there are these different things that is done with funding to kind of bring more women in. But I think that even though you try to do these smaller things, money is so important for your resources and networks. So it's difficult, and I also think that you need some kind of level of money, and you can see in a lot of countries you have, in order to become a politician, at least at a higher level, you need to have some kind of access to resources. So what we're seeing in a lot of places is that at the local level, in the community level, women are very active in politics, and also a bit going back to what Irene says, that in a lot of places there are very few men, because men could possibly go and work other places. For instance, in Southern Africa, it's common for men to travel up and down to get goods from South Africa, to work in factories, and also to be, away from war, and even also migrating to other parts of the continent and Europe and other places, and that kind of makes. Going a bit back to what you're saying, but these dynamics at the local levels, we can see that there is a lot of engagement at the local level, but somehow, and that is really important, but to go up to the national level, then it's more complicated. And we also had this study of once in Malawi, where we looked upon who was the kind of most favored leader, and then it was a woman. We found out that the most for the voters, they preferred a woman over a man, and a woman with small children. So that was kind of the interesting, and that was but that is quite difficult for to be very engaged in politics at that, But it's kind of an interesting thing about how voters are not necessarily discriminating against women, but it's so, as you say, it's this money and these resources and having, the opportunity of doing these things. And also maybe to travel in some places. Because if you are a woman, can you travel away from your constituency? Can you travel away from your house? It's easier to be at home, and you can have a lot of power and also a lot of importance in your community. But can you travel away to the capital? So I think there's this local level, national level politics that is important too. That also there's a difference between what's possible for women and men to do.
Just like in my country of origin, Congo, when you speak about the capital, Congo is literally Norway 7 times. For someone to travel from where I'm from to Kinshasa, and then have small kids, then I don't see that happening.
This is where the when comes in. So older women who might have the children might have already moved, they have less responsibilities but also more power and influence within the community. They might have this possibility of staying away. Their voice also carries out more than younger women in a parliament setting, in a national setting with so many men. And a lot of young men that tend to not respect younger women. So
that's why I got my first gray hair here. So I take very good care of it, because I know I will get more respect in my
I'm glad you look at it that way.
It's right here.
But Irene, you've spoken about the importance of being seen as a resource rather than a victim in your own experience, and migrating to Norway and so on. How does this mindset shape your view of women's leadership in Africa?
Yes, for me, like I mentioned earlier, so after the war came, and I survived because of the ladies, and I ended up here in Norway as a refugee. By then I was 16. The first time I was a refugee, I was 6 years. And those years, it was actually not that bad, to be honest. And that's because I always had role models. There was always a woman there that used to impress me. And but then when I came to Norway, I thought then I just have to do the same thing. There's probably somebody that will impress me here, and then I can try to learn from them. Now I'm thinking about career-wise. But when I came here, I didn't find a lot of Congolese women who have make it in a way. Those who have managed, they were into health sector, and I cannot work with health at all because I'm too dramatic, and I've noticed if you have pain, I will also start feeling, oh, me too, I have my head hurts. Yeah. So even though they were like, so I met Congolese women here in Norway who were like, health nurse and other things, but I still expected to see them in other area and succeeding, because I'm used to see women doing things that were really impressive. I didn't find, actually, and it's very difficult to make it here. And I think one of the reasons is the way you are viewed as an African woman. There's some expectations that limit also what you can do. Maybe I'm wrong, but I really have seen that I've come. It didn't take long for me to see that I've come to a country where most people grew up with these ideas of you need to finish your food on your table. Think of those hungry kids in Africa. And when you've been viewed in a very that kind of way, as this somebody that need to be saved and somebody that need help, I don't see how then you can be seen also as a leader. You will be very lucky if you even get a job then good. And but even though I would sit here and say all these things about being a woman, but I think it's maybe worse for the men, because I've noticed last time it was actually on Women's Day, where I had a conversation with someone who was like surprised that my husband was not Norwegian, because they see me here and there and like, yeah, but I thought your husband was Norwegian. I was like, no, I've said that before. My husband is from Ghana and not from Fana. And she was like, yeah, but she's not used to for African men to be supportive, so she thought he must be Norwegian. Like, yeah, he is actually on paper, yes. Yeah.
So there's this sort of underlying bias that in that context, in the sort of the African familial context, that you will have a certain role that where you don't take those leadership roles.
You don't get the leadership roles in a way. So now I would not of course, even here in Norway, the higher in the hierarchy, you get less women, but then again, even less women with the immigrant background. And I think it has to do with the way we view each other. Because if you just focus on the things I'm not good at, and then, I can't get the opportunities that I need to grow. But if you focus on the things that I can really do, then I can grow from that. Yeah. Yes.
And I think that's you touch back upon the prevailing narrative about African female leadership as well, which you perhaps felt in a different way when you came here, and sort of felt like you are viewed in a different way. But it's also a general narrative that we really need to work on changing. So if I was to ask you, like, if you look forward 10, 20 years down the line, what is your hope that when we talk about African leadership, how will we be referring to female leadership in Africa? Open to you all.
Well, hopefully we will not talk about female leadership, and maybe kind of then feminist leadership. All these because I think it's important what Irene is saying, that this idea we always have of the men, always going back to quotas as well. It's always men who decides that there should be quotas. It's always men who makes that decision. Of course, women can be fighting for it and promoting it, but it's men who take the decision of should there be a quota or not. At least if there is, because they are the leaders, and that's why you want quotas, because women are not. And I'm thinking that a lot of times we're thinking about it, and especially speaking about African countries and authoritarian contexts, that men always do that because they have some kind of thought behind it, that now they're going to bring women there as token, they're going to be bring women there to kind of increase the loyalty for the regime. But it's never about actually a wish to see women excel, and because they have believed in women as leaders and the female leadership. It's never this idea that, you know, they are bringing women in as leaders because women are good leaders and they can do better for the country. It's never about that. So maybe 10 years from now, we will think that we should discuss, at least have that idea that, you know, maybe sometimes also men and a lot of men just supports this kind of gender or kind of more about diversity in politics, because there are good leaders of different kinds across the board. And it's not also it's not just that they are bringing people on board because they want to manipulate them in a way, which we kind of, that's speaking about what you say, I think is really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
You can go.
No, well, I hope that in the future that we can also, starting from now, actually to dare to talk about these success stories about African leaders, to really show them there that we really do have role models that we can learn from, even both in Africa but also outside Africa, like the showcasing these good female leaders that we can learn from.
Yeah. So I think that to change the narrative about African leadership, we need to change the narrative about Africa. So I think that the important thing is that the world, and picking up what Irene was saying on how we view Africans, because Africans are viewed as beggars, as a failing continent, as this patriarchy in Africa is worse than everywhere else. African men cannot be progressive, and I'm actually of the idea that whereas in Europe we talk about men as feminist allies, I actually think that African men can be actual feminists because of this matriarchal sort of framework that is embedded in a lot of our societies and cultures, that these strong women examples exist both for women and men, right? So the way Africans view themselves, how a lot of the narratives of migrants is, I wasn't black until I came to Europe. I didn't realize that I was oppressed. I didn't see it like that. I've always had good examples of women to show me the way, to lead me, and Irene's case really showcases that. So looking at how, Africa has strong humanist values, and we have progressive values that have been sort of relegated to as non-existent, as not part of who we are. So to see Africa as part of the world, as contributing to the world, as having equally valuable values, not just the negative, the patriarchal, the unequal, etc., but also the good that is in there, will help see the women, because we see them. We in Africa, we see them. So we need the world to see what we see. Yeah.
Let's see if there are any questions from the audience, or don't know if we can see any questions online. Is there anyone here who has a question they want to pose to our experts here?
Yes, thank you very much for interesting talks and perspectives. I was just having a more question about the policy and implementations of gender quotas, especially in Parliament. Could you say that the countries that implement these quotas already have element of less patronalism, that these quotas are actually not some radical change. It's more like the founding ideas that are prominent in the dominant cultures in those countries. Or do you have examples of these quotas actually being more of a radical change, like fighting against patronism?
Yes. Ragnhild, maybe you want to go first?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and I am thinking about that. I think in some places, so at least I think in some countries, the quotas, so for instance, the reserve seats in Uganda and also in South Africa, where the ANC has the quota in voluntary party quotas, I think that's part of the transformation that they wanted. They wanted to go to something else, at least in the beginning. They wanted to bring a new kind of way of governing that should be more inclusive and inclusive of different groups that had been marginalized in the previous regime. And I do think really that was a part of the idea. Then you have, so if we talk about Africa, I'll find examples other places where there has been this really transformative idea coming in with that and been fighting. I think in France there's been a lot of things going on lately. They were thinking about Europe really behind when it came to women in politics, and really in the mid 2000s taken huge steps and trying then also to, it's difficult to say if it's transformative or not. But then you also have other countries where it's not really a part of the transformative idea at all. It's difficult to say. I think Rwanda, for instance, is very difficult to know if it was what was going on there. Actually, to be honest, with the quota system and the reserve seats, and I think it's. I don't think it's in a way maybe it's transformative, but not necessarily. And Senegal, there's also, I'm not sure if it's transformative, but there's a lot of things that is happening there as well. At least there has been more women coming in. So I think that, but in some countries there has been quite stubbornly not having quotas, and you can see that there's not been a lot of transformation going on. For instance, in Ghana and in Botswana, and also Malawi is trying, but it's doing all the other things than quotas. But it's really not really so many things happening then, and is not really transforming much. So it's difficult to say. But I think it's a good question and a way to see it, to kind of study further. I think, yeah. I don't know if you.
Well, I'm thinking of Nigeria, that has one of the lowest participation of women in parliament, but at the same time it has one of the highest middle and senior leadership in economics. So, it's very difficult to think about the parliament as the sort of the standard to say how it represents society. It's one way where transformation can happen. It's one way where we can measure, but we need to look at more than that.
Yeah, and also, for instance, in Malawi, where they do not have the quotas, but they have actually some female chiefs who has been taking a really transformative role in, for instance, fighting early marriages, and where they have seen that those who are most kind of best equipped of doing that kind of work and explaining the policy and why this is important and all that. That's kind of female chiefs or chiefs. So it's not always politicians who is kind of bringing transformations. It could also be other. But of course, in this case, it needed to be a policy, and then they thought that okay, maybe the chiefs and especially female chiefs are those who can champion change.
I'm also thinking a little bit more radically, this imagination of this state, and it has been called, it's extremely phallocratic. So it's not the space for women, So, and the women who come in, they most likely will have to sort of think in the lines of this phallocratic state. And so some women just prefer to work outside of the formal structures because they can do transformation much easier and better than not just customary. I'm thinking about also activists and that kind of do politics outside and pressure the state. Yeah.
Interesting point. Any more questions? No.
Hello, we have a question online.
Yeah. Okay.
So, there is an increasing number of women seeking nomination or appearing on the ballot at the same rate as men for the same constituencies. However, despite the majority of voters being women, female candidates are still not winning. What do you think are the key factors influencing this outcome? We have a second question. We're going to answer the first question first, and then. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Any insights into this? This is Ragnhild.
Yeah. So it depends on. In some contexts, it depends really on the political party and if they are actually getting the support of the strongest party. So you can see women standing up, and even some parties that do not have a chance at all to win. They sometimes, at least not in that constituency, they could also bring in women just to show that we are doing something, although they doesn't. We also talk to women about why do you stay when you don't have a chance to kind of win, and it's also something in an African context. That's what I've heard, that some stands in order to get name recognition. So your idea is not actually to win. You don't think actually that you are going to win, but in a way to push your career in other areas. If your name is, so after you've been on the ballot, people know your name, and then you have easier to get a job in an NGO or something like that. Yeah. So that's also a thing. And of course, I'm not sure. There are these different studies of how voters are discriminating against women or not, and always when we're trying at least to do these experiments, women come out as preferred ones. But sometimes you can even see in Norway that personal votes are often going, when at the local level we do have this open list PR system where people can give personal votes to candidates, and men always get more personal votes than women, and this is Norway local level. But it's also with seeing that now we did this small study that is also about experience and name recognition. So you kind of, it's not necessarily just about gender, it might be, but it could also be about this kind of name recognition then. But I'm not sure, because now we've been talking about this name recognition and women being really important in the local level. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, and we can also, when you were talking, I was just thinking if this is also like a global problem, because we also saw this in the US election, where there were also women who choose not to vote on other women.
Sad but true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also, I guess, a challenge that's not recognized that well, maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's this also kind of this idea that's around what we've actually heard a lot when we've been doing interviews with politicians, that women are taking women down, and I'm not sure about that. I think it's a lot of things going on, but sometimes, why women?
If I can speak from the feminist perspective, this expectation that all should fall under the women's responsibility. Men should also vote for women. Why should So, I think that it's not about women bringing down other women. It's not people not recognizing that women can be progressive and conservative. We have diversity of thought and independence of thought, and so what we might be also witnessing is sort of. We have the backlash against gender equality. We have sort of this increase in conservative thinking. So what I see, for example, in Mozambique is at independence there was this very leftist movement and very progressive, and we managed to sort of bring in a lot of progressive practices, and then we had this democratization, and there was strong talk about gender equality, etc. And this has happened, I think, toward some 30 years, and now we're having backlash. Now we have, of course, we have more inequality, and then people are more conservative. They are voting conservative, even though we have this party politics that's kind of works towards these two powers. But we see also the talk, what kind of candidates people consider more impressive, how populism is gaining ground also here. So Africa is behaving very similarly to the rest of the world. The only thing I would say is because it has had crisis running for a longer time, it has had less wealth for a longer time, or inequality has been growing for a longer time. The other parts of the world are feeling it now more strongly, and whereas we have been kind of feeling it for a while. And so it becomes more difficult, I would say, to do the votes if we're thinking at it globally, I would say.
I think we're running out of time. I think there was one more question. Do we have time for that?
Question correctly is, should we bring change through quota or through empowerment? Which is a better way to bring women to leadership areas?
Oh, that's a big question. Is there a way of answering that in a short way?
Both.
Yeah.
I think that's necessary. Both. Actually, we need to do both.
I think quotas are important, but in the sense of, why should only men be there, right? It's ideally we should have a system in which we look at a place, and if we don't see women or we don't see men, we find it strange and we don't like it. But until we get there, quotas are important. I don't like empowerment.
It's going to be a conversation for another day.
Conversation.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Let's conclude
next year.
Thank you so much. I think this has been a very interesting learning session for all of us, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experiences, and from your research and from your lives, and we really appreciate everyone who's been here to join us from their busy schedules today. So I think this is an important part of shifting the narrative, as we talked about how important that is, of shifting the narrative of Africa and women's leadership opportunities, and not only focusing on the obstacles or the challenges, but also changing how we look and understand how leadership is practiced in the African context. So this is a good start, and I hope we can have more conversations going ahead in this area. So thank you all, and I wish you a wonderful week ahead. Thank you. Great.